Good evening, Dark Ones. This is your host, Deimos. I'm here with a Halloween treat, and perhaps even a few tricks. Welcome to the dark. Tonight's tale, an All Hallows tale. Welcome to our Halloween special. Urban legends and myths, Halloween holds plenty of them. But tonight's tale will take you down many turns and twists. It may even take you into the dark. An All Hallows tale. Every Halloween, the urban legends fly like a colony of bats. They're just all over the place. Tales like Bloody Mary, the Hook, and the Wailing Woman in White. Let's not forget razor blades in an apple, or the candy. And stop me if you've heard this one. The 13-story haunted house. Although it's been told in many states, the story is actually from Pennsylvania. Tonight's story, however, is from a smaller town. Yes, there are many tales, especially on Halloween. In the town of Red Fork, there is only one tale told on Halloween, partly because it's true. The other reason is because it's the anniversary of when it occurred, and as weird as it may seem, it's how they keep young Henry's memory alive. It may seem creepy, I get it, believe me, but there it is. Henry and his friends had waited all year for Halloween. This year was going to be special. They were going to see Old Man Kramer's scarecrow. That may not sound like a big deal to you, but you didn't grow up here. About 7 years ago, the police found Old Man Kramer's body in one of his fields with his face ripped off, bone and all. He was lying at the foot of the scarecrow, and the scarecrow's face was covered in Mr. Kramer's blood. Everyone in Red Fork had seen all the newspaper clippings, and they had all heard the stories. Like most people, Henry and his friends believed it was a person responsible for Old Man Kramer's death. By now, the killer was dead or very old, they thought. While they didn't believe there was any real danger, it was still scary and something you could dare each other to do on Halloween. So here it was, October 31st, the moment they had been waiting for. They threw on their costumes and met up at Henry's house. They left to go trick-or-treating, the parents none the wiser. Pretty slick for a bunch of 13-year-olds, they thought. Now unsupervised, with the sun gone down behind the earth, they headed for the old farm. Making their way down an old country road, flashlights in hand, you could have felt the excitement flowing off of them. They arrived at the edge of the overgrown corn rows, and all 5 boys stood cemented to the ground. "We came all the way out here. We're not going to chicken out now, are we?" Henry urged. Of course, no one wanted to be the chicken, so they followed Henry in. After searching for nearly 20 minutes, they found what they were looking for. Old Man Kramer's scarecrow. Its face was stained a reddish brown. "Touch it, Henry, I dare you." He knew this was coming. Jimmy always did this to him. One day he'd get even with him. He took a deep breath and reached out with a trembling hand. His hand got closer and closer. Everyone was holding their breath as Henry made contact with the scarecrow's sleeve. Henry let out a breath, feeling relieved. "See? Nothing to it." Henry's boast came prematurely. "Finally, I've waited for so long," they heard in a deep, gravelly voice. Henry screamed and they all ran. The cornstalks tore at their faces as they sprinted through them. Henry couldn't keep up with his friends no matter how hard he tried. They were leaving him behind. He looked over his shoulder to see the scarecrow right behind him. He tripped, but the scarecrow caught him before he hit the ground. Henry started giggling. Okay, quit tickling me." The scarecrow picked Henry up and set him on his feet. "That was awesome, Dad. How'd you do that voice?" Henry's voice trailed off. he started noticing things. He noticed that the razor-sharp teeth of the scarecrow began to smile. He noticed how much taller the scarecrow was than his father. He noticed that its eyes began to glow. He noticed the foul smell emanating from the scarecrow. As Henry backed away, his foot caught something. He twisted, trying to catch himself, as he went sprawling into what he thought would be the ground. His face smashed into something soft, wet, and warm. He quickly lifted his head in frozen horror as he saw he had just pulled his face out of someone's entrails. Entrails that were hanging out of a huge gash in somebody's stomach. His eyes involuntarily made their way up the torso to see the face that was frozen in a look of terror. The eyes were much wider than Henry had ever seen them before, and he had seen them before. They were his father's eyes. Henry is suddenly snatched up by the back of his shirt, the front of his collar digging into his throat until it was impossible to breathe. He was spun around midair, leaving him eye to eye with the scarecrow. The last thing Henry saw was the scarecrow's mouth open impossibly wide, right before it closed on his face. Its lower teeth slammed up into the bottom of Henry's jaw, and the upper teeth sunk into Henry's forehead. The mouth began crushing Henry's face until the entire faceplate of his skull shattered, and there was nothing but gore and an empty hole where Henry's face once sat. Then there was nothing but silence. The silence was finally broken by hooting and clapping. "You really outdid yourself, Gerald." "Yeah, that was the best story ever." They were all attempting to sound like they weren't scared, but Gerald could hear it in their voices. And was that urine he smelled? A smile spread across his face. It wasn't that he took pleasure in his friend's suffering. It was that he wanted to be a successful horror writer. Horror stories were a dime a dozen. Heck, you could find a dozen for free. Just go to Reddit or YouTube. If you wanted to be legendary like Stephen King or Edgar Allan Poe and make a living off your craft, you had to stand out in a crowd. In the horror genre, the only way to stand out was to be the scariest. You had to give people nightmares they would never forget. He had come up with a rating system so he could see where he was at. He rated his story in skulls. 1 being a dud, unable to scare a toddler. A 10 would be so terrifying it would put you in the loony bin. I'm talking padded cells and straitjackets. So you see, it wasn't that he wouldn't feel bad for one of his friends if they got so scared they pissed their pants. He smiled because eliciting that kind of response meant he had finally written a story worthy of 7 skulls. Reaching that level of terror put him that much closer to achieving greatness as an author. He had written a few stories that rated 6 skulls before, but never 7. If he could hit 8 or 9 skulls, he would finally be ready to publish. There would be no denying him his place amongst the great. He had dreamed that one day his name would be up there with King, Coots, Craven, and of course Romero. His entire future was riding on his ability to write that story. And his entire life was about making that happen. His stories had been getting scarier and scarier, but now was not the time to back down. Now was the time to take it to the next level, and Gerald believed he was ready to do just that. "I'll catch up with you guys tomorrow. I have to stop off somewhere on my way home," Gerald told his friends after packing up his stuff. "You sure, man?" "Yeah, I'm good. Just have to pick up something for my mom." "Okay, see you tomorrow, Creeper." They had called him the Creeper, or just plain Creeper, ever since his first story, The Crib Creeper. It wasn't all that scary, but everyone who read it thought it was great and told him he should write more. So he'd been writing ever since, and chasing his newfound dream. Tonight was going to be the night. He just knew it. He had met a man who said that Gerald had a gift. He had also told Gerald that once he wrote something scary enough, he could show him how to make it even more frightening. In fact, the man told him he could help Gerald write the scariest stories ever told. Gerald was extremely excited about this prospect. It was, after all, exactly what he wanted. Tonight, he thought, would be the night. This would be the story. The man was very tall. He was at least 6'6", Gerald thought. He was also very thin and very old. The clothes he wore were from another era long since past. He had introduced himself as Randall Clemens, and did so with a crooked grin that Gerald had become familiar with. He often flashed that same grin when Gerald would come by Mr. Clemens' store to show him his latest work. Mr. Clemens would tell him story after story. You're almost there. Just a little more fear. Gerald thought he knew what the old man wanted, and he was sure this story was it. Gerald walked down the dimly lit small-town street until he saw the old brick storefront he was looking for. He suddenly had a feeling, a creepy, dark feeling. It was the feeling of someone watching you, someone following you. He paused for a moment, looking up and down the empty street. He saw no one. Man, my story must be good. It's even got me creeped out. As he said this to himself, he noticed his words echoing ever so slightly in the emptiness that surrounded him. Another thought immediately struck him. Where were all the people? There should be at least a handful still out, he thought. He shrugged it off and moved on. He had more important things to do, and he was almost at the store. The old man was expecting him, just like every other Saturday, and he didn't want to keep him waiting. That would be bad. Now, why did I think that? He asked the vacant sidewalk. This is one serious case of the heebie-jeebies. He has to like this story. He came to an abrupt stop, finding himself standing at the entrance to Mr. Clemens' shop. He hesitated as he reached for the door. Nerves, he thought. He was sure this story was the one, but what if it wasn't? Only one way to find out, he told himself, and opened the door. It made its usual creaking sounds, accompanied by the sound of a little brass bell jingling. This had always put a smile on Gerald's face. Gerald believed that Mr. Clemens had left it that way with the intent of creeping people out. "Mr. Clemens," Gerald called out. "Back here, Gerald. What eerie delight have you brought me tonight?" Gerald hurried back and handed him the leather-bound folder he favored for his manuscript. He thought they gave it something a little extra, and presentation was everything after all. "Well, have a seat, and let's get started," Mr. Clemens said with a grin. Gerald did as he was asked and sat there licking his lips nervously. He had a lot to be nervous about at the moment. This could finally be the night he'd been longing for. As Randall Clemens read silently, he occasionally furrowed his brow, making Gerald all the more nervous. Gerald knew this was intentional, but knowing that didn't seem to help. When Mr. Clemens finished, he set down the manuscript and let out a little whistle. He grabbed a kettle of hot tea he had placed on the mat that resided on a small end table next to his chair. Steam rose as Randall poured 2 cups of tea and handed one to Gerald. "Where should we begin?" said Mr. Clemens before taking a sip of his tea. Gerald was overflowing with anticipation to the point he felt he might explode. Randall Clemens' grin broadened into a smile, bigger and somehow creepier than anything Gerald had seen on his face before. "This is the one. This is the story we've been waiting for. Now we finish our tea." Gerald just stared in disbelief. That's it? Just drink some tea? He had finally done it, and they were just going to sit here and drink tea? "Patience, Gerald," said Mr. Clemens, as if reading Gerald's mind. Of course, Randall didn't need to read Gerald's mind. This was all by design. Randall was enjoying watching Gerald squirm. Everything Randall Clemens did had a purpose, and always led up to something greater. You didn't achieve your goals by going about things randomly. No. Everything he did was by design. I have just what you need right here in the shop. Don't you worry, Gerald. Gerald relaxed a little, realizing Mr. Clemens was just screwing with him. Like a cat plays with a mouse, a voice inside his head told him. Still, the excitement was eating away at him. It was everything he could do to contain himself. He just had to know what the secret that Mr. Clemens held was. Soon enough he would know, and his dreams would be realized. He just had to be patient a little longer. When Randall Clemens stood, Gerald nearly exploded out of his chair. Nearly. He held himself back with great restraint, which of course took great effort. Now he would finally be rewarded, or so he thought. Mr. Clemens beckoned him to follow, and follow he did. As the old man led him down to the basement, Gerald became quite nervous. By now, however, any sort of reasoning was far beyond his grasp and completely overshadowed by desire. The basement was a musty, dimly lit affair that reminded Gerald of a Dark Ages dungeon. The smell of ancient mildew was almost overpowering, and he thought he saw movement out of the corner of his eye. The image of something lurking in the dark shadows ran through his mind like a monster in a sinister playground. By the time they reached the dilapidated bookshelf, Gerald was sweating profusely. The massive amounts of spider webs that were clinging to it must have been the only thing keeping it upright at this point. Ah, here we are, said the old man as he pulled an ancient tome from the top shelf, sending up a plume of dust into the air. Randall walked over to a nearby table and dropped a book on it, causing yet another eruption of dust, and a loud bang which reverberated through the dark chamber. This contains everything you need. Opening the cover, he produced a piece of paper from within. To Gerald, the yellowed piece of paper felt much like parchment. Maybe it was. The old man was partial to his peculiarities. First, the contract, the old man stated plainly. It simply states that you take full responsibility for your stories and any consequences they may render. Words can be a powerful thing, you know. It further states that no monetary compensation will be required for the use of these materials, but you will be held to a 13-story minimum in order to complete the contract. Do you understand and agree, Gerald? Yes, sir. Good, said Mr. Clemens, handing Gerald a quill. Sign here, here, and here. With that completed, your long-awaited journey can begin. Gerald hastily signed the parchment in all the indicated places and handed it back to Mr. Clemens. The old man quickly placed it back in the book and turned the page. Gerald could see that a stack of leather binders was held within. The old man retrieved them, blew the dust off, and handed them to Gerald. Write your stories in these, starting with the one you showed me tonight. Turn each one in to me as you complete them, and we'll distribute them to the world. So, you'll be my publisher? Asked Gerald. In a manner of speaking, yes. Don't worry, the results will be prompt, I assure you. Thank you, Gerald said nervously, although he could not have told you if it was out of excitement or fear at that very moment. I'll start tonight. Gerald was ready. He would wait no longer, save for the walk home, of course. When he got there, however, he would begin immediately. He would have his fame, and he would have his fortune. Just as he had told himself, he got to work immediately upon arriving home. He opened the first of 13 leather binders to find the same style parchment as the contract. He liked the way his writing looked on it. He thought it added to the creepy factor. By the time he was done transferring today's story, he was on fire. He immediately grabbed another folder and just kept writing. The stories were flowing out of him like never before. When the sun came up, Gerald was exhausted, but he had written 3 stories. He wanted to take him to Mr. Clemens as soon as possible, but he couldn't even stand up. He fought the weariness with all his might, but in the end, he lost the battle. His body slumped forward until his head was on the table. He tried to lift it one last time before it dropped back down on the desk with a thunking sound. Everything went black. Gerald woke with a startled cry. He'd been having some kind of nightmare, but couldn't for the life of him remember what it was. His eyes adjusted slowly and he found himself still sitting in his chair. Craning his stiff neck to look out the window, he noticed it was already night again. He took him some time to stabilize himself enough to walk. His legs had fallen asleep and were on fire with pins and needles. He knew he had to hurry. He needed to get these stories to Mr. Clemens. Finally able to walk, Gerald quickly put 3 completed stories in his pack and headed for the door. As he did, something came to mind. He hadn't noticed before, but there was an odd texture to the leather binders. They felt familiar, but he couldn't place it. He reached up and touched the skin on his face with a shiver. All this writing has his imagination on overdrive, he thought. Shutting the door behind him, he stopped cold, but wasn't sure why. Something just felt out of place. Whatever it was would have to wait. When he arrived at the old man's shop, he hesitated, reaching for the door. He couldn't shake the strange feeling he'd been having since he woke up this evening. Again, it would have to wait. Somehow he knew Mr. Clemens was expecting him. How could he be? He thought to himself. How could he possibly know that Gerald had completed 3 stories, let alone 1? Still, Gerald was sure of the fact that Randall Clemens was waiting on him, and Mr. Clemens did not like to be kept waiting. He stepped into the shop and saw no sign of Mr. Clemens, but a second later, he heard his voice come from behind him all the same. "There you are, my boy. Productive night, I hope." He turned to see Randall Clemens, his grin as creepy as ever. He was sure, even after the briefest of glances, that Mr. Clemens already knew exactly how productive the previous night had been. "Ah, yes, this will do quite nicely indeed. I'm proud of you, Gerald. I can see I haven't been wasting my time." "Thank you, Mr. Clemens," Gerald said quietly, not sounding quite like himself. Not wanting to be there anymore, Gerald told the old man his mother was waiting for him, and he had to get home. "Of course you need to get home, son. You have more writing to do." Gerald thought about telling Mr. Clemens he was too tired, and would write more tomorrow, but something made him think better of it. "Of course, Mr. Clemens," Gerald responded despite his fatigue, and despite feeling as if he wouldn't be able to write. The walk home seemed longer than usual. Gerald was utterly exhausted. Still, he trudged on. Reaching his home after what seemed like hours, Gerald climbed the stairs begrudgingly. His only thought was to collapse on his bed when he made it to his room. Once he got there, he couldn't quite make it to the bed. He needed to sit for a minute. He dropped into his chair and leaned back, letting his arms hang down. He felt his fingertips brush against something smooth and soft. He picked it up to see what it was and found that he was now holding a leather binder in his hand. He woke up 6 hours later with 2 completed stories sitting before him.
There's no way I could have written 2 stories in 6 hours. I'm lucky if I finish one in a week. A short story maybe in a day without editing. This isn't possible.
Gerald couldn't wrap his mind around what was going on here, but he dreaded seeing the one person who would have the answer. He didn't want to be in that store. He didn't want to see that crooked grin. He didn't want to ask Randall Clemens. An hour later, he found himself sitting in a chair being served a hot cup of tea by none other than Randall Clemens. He had seen him as a harmless old man who just wanted to help him. Now, he suddenly found himself deathly afraid. He took the cup with a trembling hand and took a sip, hoping it would calm his nerve.
So, what do you have for me, my lad?
Gerald reluctantly handed over the 2 manuscripts, and as they slid from his hands, he became certain. These binders were bound in human skin. He sat and sipped his tea while Mr. Clemens read his latest work. Even if fear didn't keep him in his seat, fatigue certainly would. When the old man finished reading, a big smile grew upon his face. It was somehow scarier than his usual creepy grin.
Very good, Gerald. Very good indeed.
I released your first book yesterday. Would you like to know what people are saying about it? Gerald slowly nodded. Randall Clemens opened a laptop computer and flipped through various social media sites. Gerald couldn't believe his eyes. Dozens upon dozens of people, site after site, all talking about his book.
This is only day 1, Gerald.
And close to 1,000 people are talking about your book. Imagine what tomorrow will bring. Gerald perked up a bit at this news. Was this really happening? He thought. His dreams came back to him, and with it his passion. I think I can manage a story or 2 tonight. I am feeling a little better.
That's the spirit, my boy. 5 down, 8 to go. After that, you'll have all the time to rest you could ever need.
Gerald headed home with a renewed vigor. He was sore and he was tired, but he was also dedicated. All the greats were dedicated. That's how they became the greats. And he just knew he was destined for greatness too. He sat in his chair and the weariness returned. His hand traveled down to his bag as if on autopilot. No sooner than he grabbed the next folder did his energy return. He put his pen to paper and it flew across page after page. Panting and sweating like he just ran a marathon, he sat staring at his latest book. Please, no more tonight. I'm so tired. Thankfully, he shut down completely at that point, sliding from his chair to the floor, where he woke up several hours later. He avoided leaving his house, even his room, when it could be helped. It was 6 hours before he finally broke. He had been afraid to leave his house because he knew where he'd end up. Every time he even thought about that place, a sense of doom would set in. He had avoided it as long as he could, but he now felt it pulling at him. In the end, he found himself walking to Mr. Clemens' emporium once again. He dreaded every step he took. Yet with every step, the strange gravitation pulling him towards Mr. Clemens got even stronger. By the time he had reached the emporium, he was drenched in sweat and shaking like a leaf in a hurricane. Not being able to stop himself, he opened the door and stepped in.
Gerald, my boy, how good of you to drop by.
I see you have 2 more manuscripts with you. My, you have been busy.
Yes, sir,
Gerald replied in a shaky voice, as his arm involuntarily lifted to hand over the binders. "You look exhausted. Why don't you take a load off and I'll fetch us some tea?" Gerald collapsed into the chair, and when he looked up, Mr. Clemens was there handing him a cup. After a few sips, Gerald actually felt much more relaxed. Meanwhile, Mr. Clemens was plowing through the book, eating up the words like a starved gorilla. Once he finished reading, in record time I might add, Randall leaned back and let out a little whistle. "That was excellent, young man. You're truly on the precipice of immortality." While this excited Gerald beyond words, he began to wonder what the cost of this accomplishment would be. "You mean it, Mr. Clemens?" "I certainly do, son. Wait until you see how your first book is doing now, and it's only going to get better." He pulled out the laptop again, and sure enough, it looked like there were twice as many people talking about his book now. "Wow," was all Gerald could manage at this point. "Wow, indeed. Should reach peak sales by the end of the week. We'll release your second book 2 days after that, while they're still hungry for it." Gerald let that sink in for a minute. "Do you think I'll make the bestsellers list?" He was now caught up in the hype. "No doubt in my mind. In fact, you're almost there now." Gerald went from excited to somber and asked a question that had been nagging at him. "At what price?" "Why, whatever do you mean?" "The contract said no monetary compensation, but it didn't say it was free, did it?" Randall's grin broadened, and he seemed to evaluate Gerald with his gaze. "You are a sharp one, Gerald. Of course, there is a price. Nothing is ever free. It is something you will hardly miss. It takes a bit of energy from you, something that is replenished over time. It may take a few years off your life, but it's a blessing, really. By the time you get to that age, it's filled with suffering." "They didn't say that in the contract." "Oh, but it does. You should always read the fine print." Randall held up a copy of the contract. Gerald squinted, trying to make out the fine print. "That's in Latin," Gerald protested. "You could have asked for a translation. You aren't accusing me of being a cheat, are you? I have, after all, delivered everything as promised thus far," Mr. Clemens replied indignantly. Gerald hung his head in defeat. He knew this was no ordinary contract, and there'd be no way out of it. Even with a regular contract, Randall Clemens had been delivering on his promises. A week later, with his first book on the bestsellers list, and his second already on fire, he wondered exactly how many years this was costing him. He put the thought quickly out of his mind. It wasn't something he really wanted to dwell on. Still, something else was troubling him. The fine print seemed a little long-winded for the explanation he had received, even in Latin. Gerald couldn't help the feeling there was more to it. How much more? He didn't know. A few weeks later, Gerald had 2 bestsellers and a third book released. He had finished writing 10 books, with 3 left to fulfill his contract. Gerald had learned to take breaks between writing to reduce the fatigue he experienced when working on the books. All in all, he was happy with the progress. Why wouldn't he be? The speed at which his books were selling was unheard of. He was quickly becoming everything he had dreamed of. Gerald was already receiving requests for interviews on well-known TV shows. Despite his rapidly growing notoriety in the list of achievements, Gerald felt a darkness overshadowing him. Something just wasn't right. Well, The whole thing wasn't right. But there was something else. He just knew it. He could feel it. He tried time and time again to muster up the courage to confront Randall Clemens. In the end, fear continued to overshadow his curiosity. What else could he do, he thought. He resigned himself to enjoying his success. He had just finished his 12th book, and as he sat there drained and exhausted, he thought again of what unknown consequences might eventually rear their ugly head. That's when he got the DM showing it was going to be sooner rather than later. The screen name, oddly enough, was Not a Fan of Horror. The person had created the screen name solely for the purpose of communicating with anonymity. At least till they could figure out what was what. Gerald couldn't blame them. He had trusted someone once.
I'm contacting you regarding your books. As you can guess, I myself have not read them, and that may be why I'm still alive. Unfortunately, my brother and 2 sisters have read your books and are not. Alive, I mean. They read them feverishly and repeatedly like some kind of junkies. They got to the point where they did nothing else. They didn't sleep, they didn't eat, they didn't do anything other than read your books day and night. This went on until it finally killed them. Thought you should know.
My God, that's horrible. What killed them? He asked, as if he didn't already know.
Their addiction to your books.
Gerald tried to think of a response, but before he could, another message came through.
They're not the only ones.
We need to meet somewhere. We can go over this. Something is obviously going on, and I need to get to the bottom of this. Like something out of a bad movie, they met in a diner at the edge of town. She was pretty, he thought. Heck, she was beautiful. When she had first walked up to him and introduced herself as Delilah Thompson, Gerald stuttered and stumbled his way through his words. Now he was finally letting his guard down and able to speak in an intelligible manner. So, you're telling me that when someone reads one of my books, they start reading all the other ones. What happens next?
After that, they start to change. All they want to do is read your books. Then, as if something is draining the life from them, they finally die. I don't know how it's possible, but that's what happens.
She must have seen something on Gerald's face because she suddenly looked as though she was studying him to confirm it.
You know something, don't you?
Maybe, but you wouldn't believe me.
Try me.
He painstakingly described in detail his agreement with Mr. Randall Clemens and how he'd tricked him. Gerald did so hoping the entire time that there had been no non-disclosure agreement hidden in the fine print, one that may have involved forfeiture of his soul. By the time he was done, Delilah was almost capable of closing her jaw, which had dropped halfway through his explanation.
I don't know if you're even being serious right now,
Delilah stuttered. As serious as nuclear fallout, Gerald retorted. They sat for a while trying to wrap their heads around what was going on, desperately hoping they could find a way to stop this. What would happen if Gerald confronted Mr. Clemens? What would be the penalty if he refused to finish the final book? Could Randall Clemens even do anything to him? Gerald thought that he could do something to him, but he was running out of ideas. Delilah and Gerald spent the next 2 weeks trying to come up with something. Meanwhile, more reports of people mysteriously dying were reported by the news. Gerald was selfishly grateful no one had mentioned any relation to his books. This was too much, Gerald decided. He had to do something. He told Delilah he was going to see Mr. Clemens, but refused her offer to come with him. He quite honestly feared for her safety. He had no idea what the man was capable of, but he knew Mr. Clemens had been capable of all that was going on at the moment. Mysterious death after mysterious death haunted him day and night. It haunted Gerald because the cause of death was no mystery to him. In one single selfish act, he had harmed so many. Delilah and Gerald had grown close despite what Gerald had done, and it was obvious to him that she now worried for his safety. It made his heart hurt, but he had to do something. This mess was his doing, and people were now dying because of it. He thought that maybe if he didn't finish the last book, the breach in the contract would undo everything, including the draw to Gerald's books. He wasn't sure what other cost he might incur by doing this, but even if it was his life, he was willing to risk it. Gerald had an idea. He would get a lawyer to get him out of his contract. Do lawyers even get you out of a supernatural contract? Gerald wondered. First, he'd have to find one that would believe him. He'd tried a few, but they hung up on him pretty quickly. During the next call, something interesting began happening. The gentleman on the other end was starting to ask him questions, as if truly interested. Do you believe that Randall Clemens is a demon? Do you have any reason to suspect that your soul may be a part of the bargain? Did he disclose to you fine print existed before or after you signed the contract? He was so surprised by this line of questioning, he froze for a moment, waiting for his brain to re-engage so he could answer these questions. By the time Gerald finished answering, the attorney only had one more question. When can we meet Mr. Clemens? As soon as you're available. How about tonight at 7:30 p.m.? Does that work for you? That would be great. Thank you so much. Gerald immediately called Delilah and shared the good news. She was skeptical, and he had to admit that he was too. But hey, if he was going to die, at least he wouldn't die alone. Delilah didn't find this funny, but she was relieved that he might at least have some help. Gerald was a bundle of nerves the entire way there. He thought about things quite a bit more than he should have, but caught himself before it turned into a full-blown panic attack. He honestly thought he had it under control now. The attorney, Mr. Thomas Crinkleman, was prompt in his arrival. Let's go in and have a word with this shyster. Of course, Gerald responded, suddenly feeling very uncertain. More to the point, he was scared to death. Entering the establishment, there was no sign of Mr. Clemens, aka the shyster. Without warning came the voice of the man himself. Why, Gerald, my boy, I see you brought a friend. Smart move, lad. Now that you're a big-time author, you definitely should have an attorney. We're actually here to speak with you, Mr. Clemens. I would like to evaluate that contract. Randall grinned his crooked grin, and for the first time, Joe noticed his shark-like teeth. Of course, Mr. Crinkleman. But I have provided everything thus far, as promised in the contract. And the young man does owe me one more book for the contract to be fulfilled. I see you know my name, Mr. Clemens. Kinda odd, don't you think? Not at all. I keep an eye on my clients. I like to keep an eye out for their best interests. I'm not the monster you perceive me to be, but if provoked, I can be something much worse. With almost imperceptible movement, Randall was right in front of Mr. Crinkleman holding up the contract. Take your time.
I'll put on some tea." Thomas tried his best not to show any emotion or weakness. He took the contract with a thank you that sounded slightly less confident than his prior communication. With that, Randall left for the kitchen. Gerald and Thomas both took a seat, and the attorney began perusing the contract. When he got to the fine print, he pulled out a magnifying glass and inspected it thoroughly. Gerald was surprised to find that Mr. Crinkleman could read Latin. He found multiple loopholes he deemed unethical. Finally, he finished and asked, "Where your parent or guardian's signature?" "What?" Gerald responded, a bit surprised. "Your parent or guardian's signature. You were a minor when you signed this, were you not?" "Well, yes, but—" He cut him off before he can go any further. "Gerald, we needn't waste any time on the many violations in this contract because it was never legally binding in the first place. No contract shall be entered into with a minor without the written consent from his legal parent or guardian." Gerald sat there, letting this sink in. Would this make a difference to someone like Randall Clemens? Would he just let him walk away? He suspected that it wouldn't be so easy, but he suddenly felt hopeful. He might not have to trade his life for everyone else. Just then, Mr. Clemens returned with an ornate sterling silver serving platter. Sitting upon it were 3 cups of tea, the wisp of steam swirling up from them. "Careful, it's hot," he said, lowering the platter for us to take our cups. "Thank you," said Mr. Thomas Crinkleman with obvious confidence of a man who now felt he had the upper hand. Mr. Clemens raised an eyebrow and responded with the customary, "You're welcome," before taking a seat himself. "I do like a good cup of tea, Mr. Crinkleman. Would you mind giving me a moment to enjoy it before you attempt to call checkmate? Yes, I can see you mentally dancing in your pants with eagerness," Randall said with a smirk. "By all means, do enjoy, Mr. Clemens." Gerald was getting dizzy from observing this mental tennis match. Both players appeared to be smashing the ball like McEnroe in their minds, while verbally attempting to sound properly disinterested. Gerald felt like a mouse between 2 cats. He waited nervously as the 2 men sipped their tea, anxious to discover the final outcome of this bizarre chess match. While his attorney seemed confident that he would have Mr. Clemens backed into a corner, Gerald knew he wasn't out of the woods yet. Almost an hour later, the 2 men finished their tea and Randall offered to take everyone's cups. A gracious host to the end. If Randall Clemens was going out, he was going out with class, Gerald thought. When the old man returned, he took a seat and kicked things off. As he did, Gerald could hear an announcer in his mind yelling, "Let's get ready to rumble!" Worst timing ever, or best, he couldn't decide. Regaining control of his runaway brain, Gerald tried to focus on the conversation at hand. "Okay, Mr. Crinkleman, let's put our cards on the table, shall we?" "Absolutely, Mr. Clemens. I think we've postponed the inevitable long enough. While I can cite many violations in this contract, there is only one that, above all others, voids this agreement entirely." "Do tell, Mr. Crinkleman." "Your client, as you put it, was not yet 18 years of age when he signed your contract. You did not have any form of written consent from a legal guardian. Lucifer himself couldn't forge a legally binding agreement with a minor without the parent's consent." Mr. Clemens' face had gone a shade of red so bright,
Gerald imagined he could feel the heat coming from where he sat.
"You were under 18 when you came to me?"
Randall hissed, his sharp teeth now showing prominently.
"You said you were in college,"
he screamed. I am. I graduated high school early, and you didn't say I had to be over 18.
"Silence!"
Randall Clemens was now more than fuming. His rage began to boil over, and as it did, Mr. Clemens began physically changing. Although Thomas Crinkleman seemed completely calm, Gerald's mouth almost hit the floor. Randall stood upright to a towering 7 feet tall. His skin turned a shiny black that can only be described as onyx. Gerald saw Mr. Clemens' fingers grow into long bony claws, and his teeth grow until they were 3 times larger, and somehow sharper. Randall's eyes sunk back into his head until they were replaced with 2 red-hot coals. Apparently, Mr. Clemens really was a demon, and not just metaphorically. Suddenly, Gerald had serious doubts that the laws applied to this situation. Then again, he seemed pretty upset about the whole underage thing. Had his lawyer just found a loophole that could cheat even the devil? He'd give everything away in a heartbeat to reverse the damage and walk away free. But it would be pretty cool to keep everything on top of that. If no other reason, then getting even with Randall for tricking him in the first place. Just then, the Randall demon thingy launched a fireball at Thomas the lawyer. Thomas went from mild-mannered attorney to Olympic gymnast before Gerald had time to blink. Crinkleman flipped the chair over backwards, the fireball narrowly missing his head. He did a reverse rollover, came right back to his feet, bringing the chair up with him, and uppercutted the Randall demon with it. Randall immediately swiped Thomas with a left claw, slicing half his tie off and leaving deep gashes in his chest. The scream was louder than anything Gerald had heard before. The scream was coming from Randall. It took him a moment to figure out what was happening. Thomas had been wearing a crucifix under his shirt. When Randall slashed through Crinkleman's shirt, the cross had become embedded in his hand, which was now smoking, as the Randall demon howled in pain. "Come on, kid. That's our cue to run," Thomas yelled, snatching Gerald's sleeve and yanking him into motion. They came flying out of the front door, nearly spilling into the street. Thomas helped him up, and they jumped into Thomas's car, leaving the stream of obscenities coming from the store behind him. Once they were in the clear, Gerald asked a question that would be on anybody's mind. "Do you think that he'll let me go?"
"He doesn't have a choice. That's why he came for me."
"You think it'll undo everything?"
"It will stop it from continuing, but if you're talking about those who died, I wouldn't hold your breath. While it's not impossible, it's a pretty tall order, and I've never seen it happen."
Gerald contemplated what Mr. Crinkleman had said, then something hit him. "Wait, what do you mean you've never seen it happen before? Have you seen stuff like this before?"
"Of course, isn't that why you hired me? I couldn't call myself a specialist without experience."
"Specialist?"
"You didn't read the description when you came across my number, did you? I'm a paranormal attorney. Rights of the dead versus the rights of the living, deals with the devil, and of course demonic contracts."
Gerald sat in stunned silence for a second. He'd hired him because he was the first one who would take his case. It was as if it were meant to be. "This kind of thing happens often?"
"More often than you would think. I've been doing this for quite a long time."
"What happens now?"
"We head to the church. There's someone you need to meet."
When they got to the church, Gerald was suddenly nervous.
Mr. Crinkleman assured Gerald it would be fine. He didn't know what he'd been getting into, and when he figured it out, he was willing to do the right thing. The man Gerald was introduced to was a cardinal. He and Thomas had known each other a long time. The cardinal informed Gerald that he would have to face the demon and banish it, if he wished for absolution. Gerald had given it power, so Gerald would be the one to take it away. While this scared Gerald to his very core, he knew that this was right. "Are you sure about this?" Gerald asked Thomas. "Absolutely. Not to brag, but I've banished dozens of demons." Thomas told Gerald that he would have to be confident and trust that good would overcome evil. He would need to be quick when he used the dagger. He needed to pierce the demon's heart, then recite the words. What could go wrong? Gerald thought sarcastically. The closer they got to the Emporium, the more nervous Gerald became. He felt his fear grip him tightly, but fought as hard as he could to keep it at bay. The Randall demon would know that he was coming. He always did. "I'll be right behind you, don't worry. You can do this, Gerald." "I know. I'm just trying to convince my feet so they'll move," Gerald said with a smile that he didn't feel. When they entered Randall's Emporium, it was dark. Not a single light was on. Not a single candle was lit. The Randall demon was waiting here for him. Of that he was sure. The door suddenly slammed shut behind them, and Gerald spun around just in time to see the demon drop from the ceiling on Mr. Crinkleman. Thomas howled in pain as the demon sliced open his chest with razor-sharp claws. Gerald grabbed a brass candlestick and bashed the demon across the side of his head. The demon was sent rolling off of Thomas, who lay there gasping. The demon quickly regained its feet. Gerald was fast as he lunged knife first at the demon, but the demon was faster. It batted the knife away easily, then slashed Gerald across the shoulder. The cuts burned as if stuffed with hot coals. Gerald didn't have time to deal with the pain, not if he wanted to live. The demon leaped at Gerald, but Gerald saw it coming. He sidestepped the demon and dove for the knife. When he rolled over, he saw the demon flying through the air, only moments from landing on him. Gerald got the knife up just in time to impale the demon. He used the leverage of the embedded knife to roll the demon over and came up on top of him. The demon screamed as Gerald ripped the knife out of its flesh. Gerald brought it back down swiftly, and this time his aim was true. He struck the demon in the heart and recited the verses in Latin, just as he had been instructed. When he removed the knife and stood over the demon, he felt a great sense of pride, a sense of accomplishment, a sense of victory. He had literally conquered his demon. Not many people could say that. The demon was smoking and quickly turned to ash. And although the air inside the Emporium was still, the ashes blew away nonetheless. Gerald remembered Thomas and ran to his side. Kneeling beside Thomas, Gerald did his best to comfort him. "Now why do you act as if I'm dying? I've had way worse than this." When Thomas finished choking on his own laughter, Gerald helped him to his feet and out to the car. He quickly drove him to the hospital, fearing the worst. It wasn't until after the hospital staff took Thomas into the ER that the pain in his shoulder caught up with him. Many stitches later, he sat waiting for an update on Thomas. Fortunately, they thought Gerald was Thomas's son and allowed him back to see him after surgery. He had paced the hall until they let him in, unsure of what to expect. Gerald was exhausted after sitting in the waiting room and well into the next morning, but he would not abandon the man that had been here for him, helped him out of his predicament, especially one that involved a demon. Thomas smiled groggily at the sight of Gerald. "You're still here." Now that you're not a big-time author anymore, I could use an apprentice. And if you still feel the need to write, maybe you could write about our adventures. I don't know. What do you think Poe would do?
I was compared to him once, Gerald said, laughing. So it looks like I may be back with an update sometime in the future. After all, my current career seems to have hit a dead patch. Thank you for listening to tonight's Halloween special, An All Hallows Tale. If you could leave us a like, a comment, or a follow, it'd be greatly appreciated. Also, you can check out my new book, Welcome to the Dark, on Amazon and Amazon Kindle. And I'll see you next time in the dark.